So now I'm continuing with turn 3 of the operational turns in Russo-Japanese War, the Great War at Sea. And we're still on the first day on turn 3, which I believe is February 8th of 1904. And the weather actually changes to mist, and the fleets are just going to be maneuvering on the operational map according to their orders. So as you can see in the picture, the Russian fleet number 2 is staying in Port Arthur and defending it as the Japanese are pulling away. And Russian fleet number 1 heads out from Port Arthur and starts moving to follow its orders into the Yellow Sea. Then Japanese fleet number 1 has aborted and it is heading back to base where it will await new orders. And Japanese fleet number 2, which is the destroyers that launched that sneak attack, are heading to base also. Then in this next picture, you can see Japanese fleet number 4, which is moving toward Chimalpo, where it's got a mission to unload cargo. And this is not really a friendly port, but it's not a Russian port either. So they can unload the cargo, but they have to use an amphibious landing to do it, which means they have to be there, for a number of turns to unload under these conditions. Then on turn 4, it's now twilight, and the weather clears up, so it's back to clear weather. And the Japanese Chimalpo landing force arrives in the port. You can see that in the picture. And since it's not friendly controlled, they do have to remain there 12 turns. In other words, until turn 16 to unload the cargo for the victory points. Then we go into turn 5. It's nighttime. The weather is still clear. And you can see in the picture, the ships are making their way into the Yellow Sea for the most part, other than the ones that are unloading in the port. There is no contact. Turn 6 is also a night turn. It's still clear. There's no enemy contact. And then on turn 7, we go into the next day, February 9th. It is daytime, but the weather starts to become misty. There's still no contact. As the turns continue throughout the day, everything remains clear. There is no contact. And the interesting thing to remember, this is a winter scenario, so the weather can change fairly quickly, and it tends to get worse because of the time of year, and it's harder to make it clear up. So this is really good news, actually, to both sides, that the weather is clear. And then going into turn 11, it becomes nighttime. There is mist. There's no contact. Then in turn 12, it's nighttime still. It turns to fog. There is still no contact. And then we go into turn 13, which is a new day. It's February 10th. It's the day. The fog continues. There's no contact. Then turn 14, it's day, and it's misty. There is no contact. And then turn 15, it becomes from mist, it progresses to fog. And you can see, though, that the Japanese fleet number 2, you might remember that is the 6 Ikazuchi class destroyers. They finally make their home port in Sasebo. No contact. Turn 16, it's still daytime, still fog. Then as it's turned to 16, the Chimalpo landing force has now offloaded all of their cargo from their transport ships. And this is a massive 60 victory points. So, this is definitely a problem for the Russian player. Going into turn 17, it's nighttime, it's fog, there's no contact. As it continues, night continues, the weather turns into a squall, which is more difficult, and then we go into turn 19, or February 11th of 1904, and now we go into a storm, and then on turn 20 there is a gale. A gale can be a problem for smaller ships that are out to sea, and it turns out that two of my Japanese torpedo boats at sea, their Class 21 torpedo boats, are sunk by the gale weather. Also, three more torpedo boats in fleet number 5 for the Japanese are also sunk. These all are worth victory points, and even though they are not destroyed in combat, since destroying the enemy fleet is a victory condition, I am counting these victory points of these fleets lost to the weather in favor of the other player, because it doesn't matter how the fleet gets sunk. If it's sunk, it's sunk. At least that's how I'm going to interpret the rule. Then on turns 21, the gale falls back to storm. Then turn 22, the storm goes back to gale, and it's now twilight. And you finally have Russian fleet number 1, which is maneuvering into Masampo. And since we're at gale again, another torpedo boat number 21 type sinks for the Japanese. It was with Fleet 1. And then Japanese Task Force 5 loses 2 more torpedo boats. So I'm learning it was very foolish to send these torpedo boats out into the high seas for so long with the risk of the weather at this time of year. So on turn 23, it's nighttime. It's a storm. I believe this is still February 11th, but the Japanese fleet number 1 also gets to Masampo, and it discovers the Russian fleet there despite the storm. Part of this is because the Russians had a mission to bombard Masampo. And because the enemy fleet showed up, made the Russians easy to find because they were set up to bombard. But this is going to prevent the Russian bombardment because the ships are going to engage. And I've got a picture here just showing the tactical situation. And this doesn't go very well for the Japanese. The battleship Yashima is sunk. Then the battleship Fuji is sunk. Yes, the Japanese inflict some severe damage to the Russian fleet, but all of the Russian fleet is still afloat. And the Japanese commander gets cold feet here and calls the battle off. So we go on to the next turn 24. It's nighttime. It's a storm. There's no contact. And the Russian fleet now are free to bombard Masampo, and they do so. And I believe they get 3 victory points for this, for having at least two large ships bombard. Then we go on to turn 25, turns back into a squall. This obviously is not terrible weather, but all the fleets are out of contact. And on turns 26, 27, 28, we basically have storms and squalls and no contact. And then on turn 29, it's a night turn, it's a squall, and the Japanese fleet, number 1, that just left the battle there, gets finally to base at Sasebo, and there's no contact. And that's pretty much how the game ends. There is no contact. I did want to make a comment about the Russian fleets at Vladivostok. So the Russians did have a fleet there. You can see in this picture that there's a bunch of ice around there. And during the winter months, this is a problem. Not so much for the Russians, because at Vladivostok, the Russians have icebreakers. So these icebreakers keep the ships safe in the port, but also in the 2 or 3 or 4 surrounding spaces. Just the any spaces adjacent to the port, it's assumed that these icebreakers are going to keep it clear. So if the Japanese wanted to attack there, it would be very risky for the Japanese ships. But in truth, even to get fleet number 5 of the Russians out of that port, eventually they're going to have to roll the dice for damage on the outside edges of that ice pack and possibly take damage. You can see in this picture, the Russians have 3 armored cruisers there. They're fairly good ships, as well as a cruiser, and then some torpedo boats. So the Russian commander decided to leave those ships in port because of the weather, which is probably a wise decision. In the total of all the victory points, the biggest thing for the Russians sunk a lot of Japanese primary ships. The Japanese Yashima was sunk. That's 28 victory points for the Russians. The Fuji was sunk, 28 more victory points. The cruiser Yoshino sunk, 7 victory points. And then I believe there were 9 Type 21 torpedo boats, which together add up to 28 victory points, I think. The Japanese did, however, unload all of their cargo, and that gave them 60 points. And there are points for like damage to the major ships on either side, which sometimes tends to come out in the wash. But the final score was Japan had 103 victory points, Russia had 117. And the way these score out is whoever has the most wins. That's just kind of how it is. These are still pretty close. I mean, the Japanese definitely inflicted some damage on the Russian Navy, but not enough to win. And yes, they fulfilled their mission of unloading their cargo, but I do believe the mistake of the Japanese was to engage that Russian fleet that was trying to bombard the Japanese port. They should have just let them bombard it for the 3 victory points rather than get involved. I mean, they lost a bunch of ships being out in the open sea, so they still would have lost those points. But if their battleships hadn't been sunk, the Japanese would have won this scenario. So maybe I learned a lesson there as the Japanese commander. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed taking a look at the Great War at Sea, and please stay tuned for other videos in the future. Have a great day.